Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Oncology eCOA, What the New FDA Draft Guidelines Tell Us. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your Xtalks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation by using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require assistance, please contact me at any time by sending me a message using that chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Signant Health, who developed the content for this presentation. Signant Health is an evidence generation company. They are focused on leveraging software, deep therapeutic and scientific knowledge, and operational expertise to consistently generate quality evidence for clinical studies across traditional, virtual, and hybrid trial models. For more than 20 years, over 400 sponsors and CROs of all sizes, including all of the top 20 pharma, have trusted Signant Health solutions for remote and site-based eCOA, eConsent, RTSM, supply chain management, and data quality analytics. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's webinar. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Bill Byron. He serves as a principal eCOA science at Signant Health. He has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 30 years and authored over 70 publications, as well as 2 industry textbooks on electronic patient-reported outcomes. His recent scientific work focuses on the use of wearable technology and bring your own device in eCOA in clinical trials. He currently serves on 2 ISPOR task forces related to clinical outcome assessments and leads a cross-country team leveraging wearable technology for clinical trial endpoints with the DIA study endpoints community. And there he is, Bill Byron. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jill Platko. She is overseeing Signant's scientific advisory team. Jill's guidance on electronic data collection on clinical outcome assessments and its associated diaries and questionnaires. Well-versed in best practices and regulatory requirements, Jill also develops training programs and resources for project delivery teams that cater to their specific needs. She's authored countless scientific articles and regularly serves as a panelist for industry webinars. Now it's my pleasure to pass over the mic and the controls over to our first speaker, Bill. So, Bill, when you are ready, you may begin.
Great. Well, thank you, Sonia, and thanks everybody for participating today. It's great to have so many online, and so thanks for joining. Hopefully you find this interesting. And as Sonia said, please do ask questions throughout, and Jill and I will try to answer those at the end, but also after the webinar as well. Please, you can contact us and we'll answer any questions. Okay, so, well, welcome anyway to today's webinar. I think, as you know, I'm Bill Byron, one of the eCOA scientists here at Signant Health, and as Sonia's told you, Jill Platko is also with me, and Jill is one of our senior scientific advisors here also at Signant. So great to be here. And we're going to take a look at the draft guidelines around developed by the FDA around the patient-reported outcomes in oncology trials. Great. So today we're going to review a few things. So the agenda's here on this slide. We're going to review current experience in the use of patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs, in oncology drug labeling, and also look at current challenges that we face when using PROMs in oncology trials. We'll then look at 2 key areas of the draft guidance. The first, ensuring our measures are specific and able to measure the core domains that are detailed by the FDA. We'll talk about those. And then second, addressing the timing and frequency of measurements. And then finally, we'll look at what this means for eCOA design and implementation. So Jill.
So as Bill mentioned, we're going to start with the current experience around PROMs in oncology drug labels and the challenges around eCOA in oncology studies. Next. We're going to be discussing the results seen in 2 papers published by Ari Nanathsakthi. These papers look at PROMs in labels approved first by the FDA between 2010 and 2014, and then a second paper that compared FDA to EMA labels approved between 2012 and 2016. Now, the FDA-focused paper includes 40 oncology drug approvals. Out of those 40, only 3, shown here, have PROM-related labels. Next. If we examine one of these, Jakafi, in more detail, you can see the focus of the FDA. Jakafi is for the treatment of myelofibrosis, which is a more rare type of bone marrow cancer. The trials utilized a PROM known as the MFSAF, so the Modified Myelofibrosis Symptom Assessment Form. The assessment is a daily diary, and it captures the intensity of these myelofibrosis specific symptoms on an 11-point numeric rating scale. Now, the result was a significant difference, and you can see the p-value there, in the number of patients with a reduction in the total symptom score between the study drug versus the placebo group, so 68 versus 8. Next. And that result is not just seen in the change in total score, but also in the individual symptoms. It's a very impressive result, but note that the claim is based on indication-specific symptoms that are relevant to patients, as opposed to items more related to function, let alone quality of life. Next, Bill.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jill. And that's a really nice example of labeling claims. And that the text there that we used was taken directly from the prescribing information. So, so some really nice stuff. And as you said, based in that example on disease-related symptoms using that particular scale. I think in Ari's later paper, looking at labeling and oncology drug approvals from 2012 to 2016, he evaluated approvals in 64 different indications, and 45 of these, so around 70%, included PROMs in the submissions. And of these 45, as you can see down the bottom here, actually no FDA approvals included PROM-related labeling, as we saw for the Jakafi example, whereas almost half of the EMA approvals did include PROMs in the labeling. And here's a summary of the labeling claims that were included in the EMA by the instruments that were used. So you can see that the EQ5D, the EORTC scales, and the FACT scales are the ones that we see most commonly used in the EMA labeling. So it's interesting, this difference of opinion between EMA and FDA in the use of this data for labeling claims. And Jill, let's explore a little bit more about the reasons for low PROM use in FDA labeling.
Exactly. So what does the FDA have to say about their very low numbers? So in the guidance, they leave the possibility of PRO measurements related to symptoms and even functional impacts being of value, but it's caveated with the phrase appropriately designed trials. And they're also concerned about heterogeneity in assessment strategies. So what are these study design and PRO assessment strategies that the FDA is really concerned about? Next slide. So starting with the study design, and this is from Ari's paper rather than the guidance, but it illustrates why the FDA may be concerned about study design. So there's a potential for bias around the data collected for PROMs in open label and single arm studies. The issue is that when a participant knows they're on study medication, they may experience improvements in how they feel regardless of the efficacy of the drug. Especially, it's essentially a placebo effect. And as you can see from these graphics, oncology studies are much more often single-arm and open-label studies rather than non-oncology studies, whereas it's the other way around with non-oncology studies where they're much more likely to be those randomized controlled trials. Next. Now, there's also the issue of concern over a design leading to missing data. And they're concerned about missing data, but even more importantly, why is that data missing? And the issue stems from a self-selection bias. A participant may not want to complete the assessment when they're not feeling well, and they may not be feeling well because of side effects of the treatment or progression of the disease. And the result of this bias is that the PROM results are better than reality since the poor results weren't included. So the guidance recommends putting in place various procedures and, of course, having these in the protocol to reduce missing data, such as training sites and participants and monitoring for completion, but also making sure that there's an assessment when the participant withdraws. In addition, just in general, keeping burden low can encourage a participant to complete the assessments. In fact, the suggestion here is to allow them to complete it outside the clinic. And finally, if an assessment isn't completed, document why this is, particularly if it's because the participant was just too sick to comply. So kind of taking this together, we'd interpret an appropriately designed trial would be something like a randomized controlled trial, but it has to have that strategy to both reduce the missing data and then if it's missing, to record why it's missing. So next slide. So moving on then to the concerns around the assessment strategy. There are concerns about PRO assessment strategies starting with the selection of the measure. The measure should be well defined, they say, and the questions should all be related to that concept of interest. And for example, a physical function scale shouldn't include, at least in the score, concepts like side effects or symptoms. Now, Bill's going to go into much more detail on this issue and talk about recommendations. But meanwhile, I'm going to move on to the next slide and kind of address the last issue, or at least introduce it. And it's the issue of a stress assessment strategy, particularly when the assessments are collected. So in a study where the medication is administered at the start of a cycle, the toxicity follows this type of pattern. Within a couple of days administration, the side effects due to toxicity rise dramatically and then they drop. Next. And then the drug isn't administered until that toxicity has diminished enough, so they'll push the visit out. So if the questionnaires are administered at study visits prior to study drug administration, and this is the most common model, there will be consistency with regard to the level of toxicity the participant is experiencing, but it will be consistently the lowest point of toxicity. In other words, when they're feeling their best. And so it's not surprising that the FDA might be concerned about this. So to kind of put it all together, there are multiple concerns with cancer studies that lead the FDA to hesitate about using PRO data for claims. Now, I've covered study design and missing data strategies, but Bill and I want to go into more depth about the choice of the measure and the assessment schedule. Bill?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jill. So let's look at that first one of the two topics and talk about the specificity of these PROM measures, or PROM patient-reported outcome measures. So the FDA built from the work of Paul Klutz and colleagues who published a paper in 2016 where they proposed a number of core patient-reported outcome measurement domains that would be useful in oncology trials. And this draft guidance actually expands on these to identify 5 core domains, which are listed here. So disease-related symptoms, symptomatic adverse events, the overall side effect impact measure. So this is a single item that identifies the combined impact of all the side effects in the mind of the patient. Physical function measurement. So this includes aspects of physical function like walking, lifting, reaching, things that are considered important to patient functioning, independent functioning. And then role function, the impact of treatment on the ability to work and carry out daily activities. And importantly, the FDA state that these core patient-reported outcome measures should be well-defined and reliable, but also that they should be able to discretely measure the specific domain that we're interested in. So, so all the questions included in that scale or that subscale should all be related to that domain of interest. And the reason why that's important is that they can then look at that particular core domain separately to the others. And this could be as a completely new patient-reported outcome measure, just looking at one of these core domain areas, or it could be a subscale within a larger instrument. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the commonly used PROMs that we see in cancer trials, and here's a few. That we've got the Fact B here on the left for breast cancer, for example. In the middle here, CPath's non-small cell lung cancer symptom assessment questionnaire, a bit of a mouthful. And then over here on the right, the EORTC QLQC30. So all scales that we see, particularly the FACT and the EORTC ones, very frequently in cancer trials today. So let's have a look at each of these in this sort of context of specificity of measurement. And we'll start with the CPath instrument, the non-small cell lung cancer symptom assessment questionnaire. It's a 7-item questionnaire developed to assess disease-related symptoms in non-small cell lung cancer. And these symptoms, there's 5 different symptom domains that they're trying to measure, and they were identified through concept elicitation studies in patients. And so you can see these concepts and then the individual items that measure those concepts. In some cases, a single question, and in 1 or 2 cases, there are 2 questions to assess that particular symptom. So this is an example of a questionnaire showing great specificity. It's absolutely focused on disease-related symptoms, and it's got great supporting validation work, to support its content validity. If we move to the EORTC, so here's the QLQC30, or at least the first 5 questions of it. This is a 30-item questionnaire, and it contains 5 subscales. So it measures physical functioning, role functioning, emotional functioning, cognitive functioning, and social functioning. And this is the 5 questions that actually comprise the physical function subscale for that instrument. And you can see, just if you look at the kind of the face validity of this, you can see that all the items relate to aspects of physical function. So the first one, we've got some measurement of strenuous exercise. The next 2 are about walking. The 4th one is perhaps to do with sedentary behavior. And then this final one is to do with self-care, etc. So again, on the face of it, it looks like it has good specificity. And of course, this instrument, like many of the instruments we use in clinical trials, has had a lot of validation work done. So the concept elicitation work and things that we see for the CPath instrument, we could probably find the same for this instrument as well. So let's look at the Fact B. So this is an example of one of the facet scales. This is commonly used in breast cancer. It's a 37-item questionnaire. It's got 5 subscales that we've listed down the side there on the left. So physical well-being, social, family well-being, emotional well-being, etc. And as we look at the items within each subscale, what we notice is they don't always map as well to the FDA core domains. So, for example, here with the functional well-being scale, this first item, I am able to work, and that's a good measure of role function. But the second question, my work is fulfilling, could be less relevant to role function. That seems to be measuring something perhaps a little different. And then we've got items like this one, the fourth one, I've accepted my illness. Again, related perhaps to something else. So here, this particular subscale may be less useful in mapping directly to those FDA core domains. Here's another example of the subscales. This one's the physical well-being subscale. So here we've got one item that could be disease related, could be, so I've got pain, and we've got another one here that's perhaps treatment related. I'm bothered by the side effects of treatment. The other questions, could be nausea, could be disease or treatment related, etc. So it's not exactly sure, again, if we can tease out disease related and treatment related components from this particular subscales. So again, the subscales of this instrument are perhaps less helpful in providing the specific measures that the FDA talk about in their guidance. So I suppose the question then is, well, but could we adapt the subscales that don't map exactly to the core domains and create a new subscale that would actually map very well to some of these FDA core domains? And if we return to the fact B, we could hypothetically construct a disease-related symptoms subscore by selecting some of the questions. So we could select, I've been short of breath, and one or both of my arms are swollen or tender, and that they come from the additional concerns domain. And then we could choose, I've got a lack of energy, I've got pain, I've got nausea from the physical well-being domain. And maybe the combination of those things hypothetically could be the construct of a disease-related symptom subscore. I guess the question now is, well, if I was going to go to that effort to do that, how might I validate that? And aside from license holder approval, we're going to need to look at the validation evidence to make sure that we've got enough, or we've got all of the disease-related symptoms that are important to the patients for the particular condition that we're looking at, in this case, breast cancer. So is this set of 5, for example, valid in that instance? And we might also need to look at some of the psychometric properties of the new subscore and that we produce with that subscale. And FDA provides some examples of suitable instruments for each of these core domain areas, and they've listed them in the guidance. So we've already talked about the non-small cell lung cancer SAQ, symptom assessment questionnaire. That's the CPath one. That's an example for disease-related symptoms that they've cited as a good example. For symptomatic adverse events, the PRO-CTCAE, of course, is cited. This single item, the overall side effect impact measure, we've got the patient global impression of severity, and then we've got 2 individual questions, one from the FACT questionnaires and one from the EORTC questionnaires. In fact, from the item bank, from their set of questions. And then the physical function, we've got the PROMIS scales, and also the subscore from the EORTC QLQC30 is cited as a good example, as is the subscore for role function from that instrument as well, for role function. So we've got a good starting point here of instruments and their subscales that the FDA feel fit well with what they're trying to measure. And I think the importance of that overall measure of side effects is really quite interesting, and it's not something we see being measured discreetly that often in cancer trials, although that question about bothersome symptoms is actually one of the questions in the FACT scale, for example. But here's sort of 2 examples that they cite of how we might measure this overall side effect impact measure. So the patient global impression of severity, so that would be a question like, please choose the response below that best describes the severity of your overall side effects from treatment over the past week. And the patient would pick from none, mild, moderate, or severe. And then that question we saw in the FACT B, which is represented in all of their scales, I am bothered by the side effects of treatment. ranging from not at all to very much. So again, great examples of what they're looking for. And why is this measure important? I think there's two reasons why this is an interesting and important thing to measure. The first is it enables us to capture the impact of side effects that weren't necessarily selected or included in our Pro-CTCAE implementation. So as you know, when we implement the Pro-CTCAE, we select up front a number of different side effects that we think are the ones to look at. And it may well be that a patient experiences something different, and that's not captured on that instrument. And secondly, it enables patients to attach greater weighting to side effects that are more important to them as they rate their overall impact of their side effects. So I can see two really good reasons why the FDA are interested in this particular scale, and obviously a very easy scale for us to implement. Jill.
So now that we've gone into depth about the measurements, what about the assessment timing and frequency? How should this be addressed? Next. So the guidance includes some concrete recommendations. First, include a baseline assessment. This is pretty straightforward, and I don't think I've seen a protocol yet that doesn't already do this. The next is assess more frequently in the first few treatment cycles. Well, this also makes sense, since that's when side effects can be at their worst. But again, this is already common across protocols. And then next, the frequency should take into account the administration schedule. Well, this is also typically done, but as I illustrated, the way it's currently being done is really introducing some very strong bias. And then finally, assessment frequency can be different for different concepts. Next. This is the assessment schedule that's seen in the guidance. It includes everything the FDA suggested. It's got baseline assessments. It has a higher frequency initially with in the first 8 weeks it being weekly and then monthly until month 6, and then every 3 months. And then different measures having different frequencies, such as disease-related symptoms being assessed less frequently than, say, physical function. The FDA seems to be endorsing this for all trials, since they note, and I quote, "A standard approach to assessment frequency over the first year of therapy would aid in consistency and interpretation across advanced cancer trials." Now, I actually have some issues with this approach. What about you, Bill?
Yeah, so I can see I can completely understand what we're trying to do, because I suppose what they're trying to do here is to make sure that they're able to do that comparison across different submissions, and to be able to look at drugs relative to each other, and using a standardized way, not just in terms of the domains that are being measured, but also in the way that we measure them, enables them to do that. But I think they also do acknowledge in their guidance that how a therapy is administered can affect the timing of assessment. So, for example, the peak intensity of toxicity or symptomatic adverse events can be seen to be earlier in the cycle if we've got an IV drug taken as a single bolus on day 1, versus an oral chemotherapy drug that's maybe taken daily over a period of time. And so the profile of toxicity is quite different, and therefore our optimal measurement strategy could well be different. And also, if we're comparing two drugs with quite different administration schedules, we might need to think quite carefully about how we're going to measure, so that we don't bias measures towards one or the other of those. So if we're comparing oral versus IV, we don't want to miss the peak toxicity of the IV, and equally, we want to make sure we can capture the effects of the oral appropriately. So I think, the schedule of events we see in the draft guidance as an example, it uses those fixed weekly assessments for some of the measures, like the adverse events, for example, for the first 8 weeks. And the other thing that I feel about that is it doesn't really account for what we might do if we need to reschedule a cycle. So maybe the side effects, if we see here at the bottom of these two graphs, we've moved out cycle 2 because perhaps of toxicity in the first cycle and the patient needing a little more time to recover before they administer the second cycle. But now if we fix with this rigid weekly assessment schedule, we can see we're now a little bit out of whack in terms of what we're measuring. So perhaps, you know, the optimal way to do it might be to define assessments relative to each cycle. So as you can see here, you know, we've got a number of weekly assessments within each cycle window. And, you know, the advantage here is we're not just measuring the symptoms at the end of a cycle like we were back in, you know, as Jill showed, the sort of traditional approach of the site-based assessment. We are able to accurately reflect the peaks and the recovery period from the toxicity of the drug, and we're also able to optimize the measurement strategy if cycles get shifted out a little bit. And so this seems to me to be, you know, a good compromise and maybe an appropriate way to move forward to think about this, Jill.
Yeah, I would much prefer something along those lines, because then you consistently see when they're most toxic, and you can compare across participants, and then also that goal of the FDA to be comparing across trials if they're all doing it this way. So, but what that does is it leads to the suggestion that you're collecting consistently relative to those visits, and that means that the participants would be completing the assessments at home. And so it's going to bring up a question: is this going to be acceptable? Can they complete these assessments at home? Now, Signant Health has investigated this question, and we've published the result. And the title of this publication is Optimizing Electronic Capture of Patient-Reported Outcome Measure in Oncology Clinical Trials and Lessons Learned from a Qualitative Study. So as the title says, it's a qualitative study. In other words, it's based on interviews. Now, there were only 7 individuals, so it's a small study, but they were nicely age range between 30 and 68. And they also had a range of oncology diagnosis. And finally, they considered themselves either experienced or intermediate when it comes to digital experience, so probably a reasonably representative population, if not small. Next. So the interview questions focused on the ability of these patients to complete a PROM. Now, 4 out of the 7 noted issues with neuropathy in their hands, and that's going to impact their ability to interact. And 6 out of 7 had issues with fatigue and concentration. One individual even noted the pattern that we've been talking about with regards to that toxicity. Specifically, days 3 to 6 were my dark days, and I didn't leave my bed, speak to anyone, or even eat any food. But even so, the conclusion of the study was that despite the side effects of the treatment that could affect their interaction with technology, participants did not feel this would deter or inhibit them from completing PRO assessments on the devices. Just one aside here, whether it's paper or electronic, you're still going to interact with something, whether that's a pencil or a device. You're still going to think about questions, and fatigue and concentration will still have an impact. So it's not necessarily about the mode of administration, but it's about administering them. But to reinforce this conclusion, there's a couple of quotes. And one said, "You can be bad, but not so bad you can't use nothing at all. I would make an effort." And the other one said, "You make time in the day to do it." So it appears that despite difficulties, participants would be willing to complete assessments at home, even if they're not feeling well. Next. So what does all of this mean for eCOA design and implementation? Next. So the FDA notes the use of electronic capture, but specifically related to allowing for assessments outside of the clinic, which is what we were talking about. But also make sure you document where it is. So that's an important point. Now, we've put together a few additional things to be considered. And the first is, what is the optimal solution for this home use? Is it provisioned or BYOD? And I'd probably think that it's both. So if you have a suitable solution, BYOD might be the choice. And then if not, then it would be provisioned for those without that device. Bill, you had a couple of thoughts on BYOD for this population.
Well, yeah, and I think Jill, it comes back to that publication you just described, because you said one of the quotes was, I didn't, between days 1 and 6 or whatever, I didn't leave my bed. And I kind of understand that patients are going to be inactive, they're possibly going to be in bed. That they may be able to, and they will communicate with people when they feel up to it, and probably using their own device. So it's going to be much more convenient, I think, for patients to have the app to collect the patient-reported outcomes on their own device, so that they're not worrying about, oh, where did I put that provision device? Have I got it charged up? Is it in the drawer over there? Do I have to get out of bed to even get it? They're going to be using the device that they've got, by the side of the bed, that they're corresponding with their various carers and supporters, during their treatment period. So I think BYOD is probably quite optimal for this group of patients. But it does start to raise the question that we always hear with BYOD, Jill, which is more around, well, these are going to be probably in this case secondary endpoints where they might be used in labeling claims. Is it okay to use BYOD for these sorts of scales and for these sorts of endpoints? And what do you think?
Yeah, there's a discrepancy here, and the discrepancy is between the publications about how BYOD, different electronic devices, they are equivalent. There's multiple publications that show that, and there's the basic argument where all of the equivalent studies that have been done between paper and electronic show that they're equivalent. Electronic to electronic then is even a smaller change. So, even without those other publications, it pretty much has to be equivalent. So the science is very strong. They are equivalent. But there's a reticence on the side of industry to trust that the regulatory bodies have accepted this, that they've kept up, and they also agree with the scientific literature. And my hope is that eventually the regulatory community and therefore the industry will catch up with the science, because the science really is very clear. They are equivalent.
Yeah, and Joe, we got some good signals on that actually in terms of BYOD acceptance. I mean, if they say the first signal is a lot of the COVID vaccine work that's been done, and certainly the work we did at Signant Health was using BYOD, and obviously those drugs got accepted, and they were not just for emergency use, but now for sort of full approval. So that's a great signal. And while that's not efficacy data, it is primary safety data that were being collected. And then the second is the EMA have just released some draft guidance on computerized systems, and that has a large section on eCOA in it and a large appendix about BYOD. And that makes me think that their expectation is that they're going to see more BYOD data coming through. So I think two positive signals there in terms of the direction we're going with BYOD.
So it's the trickle that hopefully leads to the stream, to the ocean, to the river, to the ocean. So
Yep.
the next question is, where do you enable at home and at site completion? So do you do it within the same solution, or do you have a separate solution for home and site-based completion? So what do you think about the same solution being used?
Yeah, so it's possible to give the patient the app on their device or on a provision device, and then when they come to site, the site personnel can switch it from home mode to site mode. So it flips it to those particular questionnaires you want to collect at the site visit, for example. And one of the nice things about that is, of course, it's we're using the same device all the time. But the other piece is, if the patient is unable to attend that site visit, or they're unwell, or they just can't make it, they can do that switch remotely, and they can get the patient to complete those questionnaires at the right time point, whether they're at home or at site. So, so some quite nice features of that solution, I think.
It actually brings up a little bit of a bit of a limitation in that sometimes the participant might forget to bring their device with them to that visit. So if they are going to the visit, they might forget it. And so then there are workarounds, but it's a little less convenient. So I think there's arguments both for and against the same solution and a different solution.
Yeah, that's fair.
Now, as far as some recommendations, use the eCOA tools. There are compliance reports that can be used to monitor compliance, and there's reminders to participants that are going to drive compliance. And then allow a caregiver to basically tap the buttons for the participant if needed. But again, make sure that attributability is maintained by having this documented in the solution. And then finally, another recommendation is consider capturing why the data is missing. But this is not necessarily going to be simple for remote capture. And Bill, we've talked about this, and you had some really good thoughts here. Do you want to share them?
If I could remember what they were, Jill.
Well, you were talking about how burdensome it could be for a participant at home.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. So I think the point here is, if we had a daily diary, for example, and which we're not suggesting here in an oncology study, but just use that as an example. And patients are supposed to record something every day, and they miss three days, so they come in on day 4, and now are we expecting them to complete a reason for missing data on each of those 3 days before they can then do their diary? And it starts to become complex and add additional burden for the patient. So I think whatever we do here, we need to keep it really simple. So, again, being able to say, look, you've missed a number of your recent events. What was the reason for this? Drop down list. I was feeling unwell. I was hospitalized. I just forgot. Whatever those reasons are. It needs to be as simple as that for it to not burden the patient further. But I guess, of course, Jill, the other way it could be done is that the site could also capture that data separately. Having spoken to the patient when they next see them, hey, I see you missed a couple of assessments last week. What was the reason for that? Right, okay, you weren't well. Right, I can enter that into the system. So important we capture those, because that's part of the kind of the intercurrent events that we need to understand when we start to build the endpoints and the estimates for based on these data. But yeah, we've got to do it in a way that doesn't burden the patient.
Also, and this is something that I talk about fairly frequently, it has to be simple for sites. It has to be simple for developers. It's a mantra of mine, and keep it simple. Avoid complexity. So you talked about how complex it could be for the participant at home, how burdensome that could be. It's also going to be difficult to program. That can push timelines out, meaning therapies get pushed out, etc. So there are, whatever solution you end up doing, I absolutely agree. It's important to collect this information. Why is it missing? Because it has an impact. But do it in a way that is as simple for everyone involved. So thinking along those lines, if I can have the next slide. There's another way to possibly simplify things, at least for a participant, and that's to include a digital health technology, or DHT. So an actigraph solution could provide passive activity and sleep monitoring. And this would provide the potential to capture outcome measures without significant patient input. Since it's continuous, it could help understand how treatment affects activity throughout that entire cycle by defining sedentary versus light activity periods. And it could even provide insight into how treatment affects sleep with parameters like that total sleep time and awakening and sleep disturbance. And I thought it was really fascinating. You've told me that there are studies that have been done with activity monitors, particularly in oncology studies. You want to share that?
Yeah, there's been 1 or 2 really good studies in the literature where they've shown the benefit of this sort of passive monitoring during those cycles of chemotherapy to understand how active a patient has been able to be. And if you can imagine that, in that first toxicity cycle that you see there, the first few days, maybe you're going to see very limited activity. and then you'll start to see the activity picking up as the patient recovers a little, and that can be really very informative, in addition to the patient-reported outcomes data that you're going to collect. So definitely worth considering, I think, Jill.
Yeah, and I think the message here is it's in addition.
Yeah.
It's great information. It's not burdensome to collect. You still also have to ask how they're feeling.
Of course.
Next.
Great. Well, look, thank you, Jill. And I think just maybe to wrap up before we go into Q&A, you know, just to sort of conclude, I suppose, with the FDA draft guidance, really helpful guidance. It's providing us with clear information about the types of measurements and the measurement domains that the FDA would like to see. It's got clear information about the measurement strategy in terms of timing and frequency of those assessments, and it identifies the importance of mitigating missing data, but also to collect a reason for missing assessment, so we can mitigate that self-selection bias that Jill referred to earlier. It changes the way that we currently implement eCOA in oncology trials. We're now going to be looking at collecting a greater volume of data from home and more frequently. So one of the things that comes out of this as well, in terms of, and if you think of the evaluation we did as we looked at some of those different scales like the EORTC and the FACT-B, researchers should carefully consider instrument suitability in measuring each core domain when selecting instruments for use. And it might be that they can do that by adapting existing scales to create new subscales in the way that we hypothesized. The FDA really wants standardization across programs, so that's not just in the measurement domains, but it's also in the way that those assessments are made, the frequency and the timings, to help them to better compare across different treatments. And along with trial design and missing data considerations, this could lead to greater use of PROM data on FDA oncology drug labeling. We'll have to wait and see. Well, thank you. And I think at this point, I'd like to hand over to Sonia. And Sonia, I think you're going to take us through any Q&A that's coming whilst we've been talking.
Yes, well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much, Bill and Jill, for that very insightful presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And just like Bill said, we're now going to start the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we'll put on our webcams for that. So hello, everyone. Now, remember, you can still send in your questions by using that questions window that's located on the right-hand side of your screen. And during the time we have together for this Q&A, hopefully we'll be able to answer them. So let's start with our first question. So Bill and Jill, are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. All right, let's go. Here's our first question. This audience member is asking, what do you think about using BYOD for the at-home collection of patient-reported outcomes data in oncology? Who would like to start with that one?
Well, I can start with it. I suspect that
Okay.
question came just before we addressed that topic, because I think we covered that quite well. But I think maybe just to summarize, you know, so my preference is, I think it's a great solution for this population. I think sometimes this population is suffering with the side effects. They're not getting out of bed, you know, for a few days, and actually doing it on your own phone is actually a really good solution for that. So I'd say it's well worth considering. And I would say that the regulatory issues or questions or considerations or concerns that sponsors have had in the past, I think we're seeing movement and a good direction towards that being very acceptable to the regulators as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's getting there. Hopefully faster.
Okay, thank you very much for answering that. Let's go on to our next question. This audience member is asking, does the draft guidance give any indication that the FDA will be more willing to include PROM data in labeling if the guidance is followed? Who would like to start with that one? Bill or Jill?
Bill?
Okay, yeah, so I think we touched on that at the end, but I think one of the things that I find is a really helpful signal is that there's a section in the guidance specifically on labeling, and whilst there's no promises or guarantees, I think the fact it's there and there's a section there makes me think, well, that's kind of the direction they're thinking, is there's going to be more consideration around labeling claims, and it kind of makes sense that, you know, they're laying out this strategy of this is the stuff we want you to collect and how you want to and how to collect it. That they would therefore be more amenable to consider labeling claims moving forward.
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee. But equally, it's also just a very sensible framework to understand better the treatment effects in a very scientific and a logical way.
Yeah, I agree. I think that their guidance, the things they're bringing up are really good ideas for oncology trials. But I also agree there's no guarantees. A lot of the guidance here is pretty heavily caveated. So moving in the right direction, doing these things would be good for the whole science of an oncology trial. And then hopefully the whole regulatory piece will follow soon after.
Yeah. All right, keeping hope alive. All right, let's go on to the next question. How should we assess the suitability of a PROM or its subscale rather, in measuring one of the core domains required?
I think I'll start with this one if you don't mind, Bill.
Thank you, Jill.
And just point out that the scoring manual is going to tell you how they've categorized the items. So it's going to give you some insight into what the items are. And then the question becomes, do they have the right ones? So that face validity that Bill was doing. So where he was looking at the different scales and pulling out the functional pieces or the role functions, etc., and saying, does this make sense? But then if they don't, and if they don't make sense and you wonder if they're inclusive, then you're going to have to start to consider more things about your basic PRO development cycles. Bill, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think maybe, one of the things is going back to the original validation work of the instrument, so you can kind of see that it's been developed. So a bit like we saw with the CPath instrument, we could see how that's been developed and how patient input had driven them towards those particular symptoms and the way to measure those symptoms. And, it's encouraging when there is that validation work to go back to for some of the existing scales. And so some of that's published and accessible, and some of it you can get from the authors and license holders. So again, I love your point about the scoring manual. I also think there's probably some validation data that you can look at as well.
Yeah, start with the information that's available.
Yeah.
And then after that, go to the PRO guidance for how to do a proper patient-reported outcome development.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Jill and Bill, for answering that. Let's go on to our next question. I'm going to try to squeeze at least another 3 questions in with the time we have here. Let's see. Okay, this audience member is asking, would it be easier for patients to use paper diaries to collect these data at home?
Nope.
Jill is smiling. Jill is smiling. Let's start with Jill then.
As I said, no, the answer is no. We can go on. No, seriously. There are preference studies out there. They've been out there since the beginning of electronic use. And what they consistently show is that there's either a preference for electronic capture or there's just no preference. It's never that, yes, I prefer paper. That would be much better. I would love to do paper. So I don't think it's easier. And you can see by their preference that they don't seem to think it's easier either. And if you look at the oncology results, neuropathy, yes, that's going to impact your ability to tap a device. It's also going to impact your ability to hold a pen. Fatigue and concentration, yes, that's going to impact your ability to answer a questionnaire on the device, but it's also going to impact your ability to answer a question on paper. So taken together, there are things that are going to be the same between paper and electronic, but you layer on top of that their preference, and the answer is that you can use electronic. You don't need to be using paper.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And I think, the other angle here, Jill, is, patients might feel they prefer paper because it gives them a little more flexibility in when they can enter the data. And actually sponsors might prefer it for that reason as well, because what we're trying to do here is make sure we don't get a diary that's empty. We're trying to mitigate missing values and missing data. And so, you give someone a paper diary and they can complete it when they feel like it, and they can give you a nicely completed full diary back. But the other thing that we know of the FDA guidance, that 2009 Pro guidance that you referred to, was they're really interested in making sure that things are measured at the time you say they're going to be measured, and it's very hard to do that with a paper diary. It's obviously very easy to do that with an electronic diary where you've got completion windows, and you've got time and date stamps and that sort of thing to be able to show that actually the patients were recording it at those right time points. So I kind of think from a data integrity point of view, we shouldn't, you know, when it comes to at-home completion of PROMs, we shouldn't be thinking about paper.
Yeah, and you started to say the flexibility, and I started laughing because that flexibility sounds wonderful, but it leads to, as you say, data integrity issues, big data integrity issues. And if you think particularly about these oncology studies, where what we're suggesting is try and have consistency through that cycle as to when you're asking these questions. You allow them too much flexibility, which you can get with a paper diary, and they're no longer answering it in a consistent way. So then, as we talked about, the data integrity takes a dive.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that. Okay, let's go on to our next question. When is it okay for a carer to complete the PROM on behalf of the patient if they're feeling unwell?
Yeah, I'll start with this one.
Okay, Jill.
It's acceptable to do this. And it's in a particular type of scenario. It's a scenario where the caregiver is the button tapper. So they would show the question or even ask the question to the patient, and then all they're doing is they're recording the answer. They're not interpreting it. They're not answering it for the patient or the participant. They're simply doing the recording. And so as long as the carer isn't choosing the answer, they're simply entering the data, then I do think it's acceptable. Bill, do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to make sure exactly what you just said, that they're not answering it for the patient. They're simply tapping the keys on behalf of the patient to help them. So that's a key consideration. Of course, we need to attribute that it's that they entered the data rather than the patients. That needs to be recorded. They can't just use the patient's PIN code and just enter it as if they were the patient. We don't want that. But I think the other thing that came out of that piece of research that you described, the qualitative study in oncology patients, was that patients, this might not be a popular solution with all patients, right? So it has to be optional. Some patients may not want their carers and their family members to know just how bad they're feeling, and they know how worried everybody is about them already. They don't want to, tell them this information, and so it may be awkward for them to do it in this way, and so we need to be respectful of that as well. And it might be that doesn't work for every patient.
Okay,
absolutely.
all right. All right, well, thank you very much. And I'm just noticing the time here. We've come to the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar, and there are still a couple of questions out there. So audience members, the team at Signant Health will follow up with you after this presentation. Now, if you have any further questions, please direct them to the email addresses that are on your screen, and you'll see that there's one there for Bill and one there for Jill. So please go ahead and utilize them. They're very happy to reach out to you. Okay, so thank you again for everyone participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, in a few seconds, I'm going to be sending you a link in your chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event with that link, and also share this link with your colleagues once they register for the recording as well. And get even more out of today's presentation by downloading the supporting materials that are available under the Handouts tab. And we have two there for you, a PDF of this presentation, and then there's a white paper, The Impact of FDA's Draft Guidance for Oncology Patient-Reported Outcomes on Future Trial Design. So please go ahead and check them out. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Jill and Bill, for that very insightful presentation. So thank you very much, Jill and Bill.
Thank you.
That's been great. Thank you for joining, everybody. Good to see you.
Okay.
Bye.
We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at Xtalks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Bye, everyone. Thank you again, Jill and Bill. Bye.
Bye-bye now.